where raiders and paratroopers held a crucial ridge against wave after wave of Japanese infantry. Fighting hand-to-hand in the darkness, the Battle for Henderson Field. October 23rd through 26th, when the Japanese threw everything they had at the American perimeter and came within meters of overrunning the airfield. Throughout these massive engagements, in the weeks between, in the quiet periods that were never truly quiet, security around the perimeter remained paramount, because the big battles were one thing. But it was the infiltrators who kept you awake at night, literally. Japanese infiltration tactics were sophisticated, professional, terrifying in their effectiveness. Small groups, sometimes just 2 or 3 men, sometimes individuals operating alone. Moving through the jungle at night with inhuman patience, they employed excellent camouflage. Not just wearing green, but attaching actual jungle vegetation to their uniforms. Fresh leaves, vines, until they looked like walking bushes. Until they could stand 3 feet away and you wouldn't see them. They moved with remarkable stealth. Professional soldiers, trained in night movement, understanding exactly how to place their feet to avoid snapping twigs. How to move through undergrowth without rustling leaves. Some spoke English, really good English. And instances were recorded of Japanese forces attempting to impersonate American personnel, approaching checkpoints, calling out in English, using American slang. The threat was real, persistent, deadly, never-ending. Herbert documented something fascinating in his March 43 interview, an additional security indicator that emerged from actual encounters. On at least one occasion, a sentry detected Japanese infiltrators not because of pronunciation, but because they used grammar that was much too precise, too correct, too formal. One infiltrator reportedly approached a checkpoint and said, "Hold your fire. We are American Marines and wish to report our evening's activities." The sentry fired immediately, cut him down, without waiting for a password, because he knew, instinctively, that no Marine would ever talk that way. Think about that for a moment. Really think about it. The infiltrator had studied English well enough to construct grammatically perfect sentences, complex sentences with proper subject-verb agreement, formal vocabulary, but he'd missed something crucial, something that can't be learned from textbooks. Natural speech isn't perfect. It's messy, informal, full of contractions and slang and grammatical shortcuts. Real Marines coming back from patrol would have said something like, "Hey, don't shoot, it's us coming in," or "Friendly. Don't fire!" Not "wish to report our evening's activities." Nobody talks like that. Nobody except someone who learned English from a textbook, who memorized proper grammar, who practiced formal speech. The infiltrator had mastered the rules of English, but he hadn't mastered the reality of how Americans actually talk. In this context, pronunciation testing provided an elegant solution to multiple problems simultaneously. It exploited real phonological differences that couldn't be faked, required no special equipment, no paperwork, no bureaucracy, could be administered in seconds, in complete darkness, provided reasonable identification when other methods failed. When visual confirmation was impossible, when documents meant nothing, the test worked because it accessed something fundamental about language acquisition, about being human. Phonological patterns established during early childhood remain remarkably stable throughout life, more stable than almost any other learned behavior, difficult to modify, even with extensive training, even with years of conscious effort. Even when your life depends on it. The term shibboleth itself has ancient roots. Comes from the Hebrew Bible. Judges chapter 12, verses 5 through 6. The Gileadites and Ephraimites were at war. The Gileadites controlled a river crossing. They needed to identify enemies trying to sneak across, so they used a word, shibboleth, a Hebrew word meaning stream or ear of grain. The Ephraimites couldn't pronounce the esh sound. Their dialect didn't have it. They said sibboleth instead. That pronunciation difference became a death sentence. The Bible records that 42,000 Ephraimites died because they couldn't say she 42,000. Killed by a sound. By the limitations of their native phonology, the Guadalcanal Marines were doing the same thing. 3,000 years later. Different war, different languages. Same principle, use language itself as a weapon, as a detector, as a line drawn in the darkness between us and them. Similar linguistic. Tests appeared in other theaters during World War II. Military forces worldwide recognized the value of exploiting phonological differences. D-Day, June 6, 1944. The Allied invasion of Normandy. The challenge and password system employed flash as the challenge, thunder as the password, welcome as the countersign. These words were chosen specifically because they contained sounds that German speakers found difficult, nearly impossible to pronounce correctly under pressure. The voiceless dental fricative. That the sound in thunder doesn't exist in German. German speakers typically pronounce it as T or S, sunder, or thunder, wrong either way. and wrong meant dead. The voiced labial velar approximant. The W sound in welcome, also absent from standard German phonology. Germans typically pronounce it as V, welcome. Again, wrong. And wrong was fatal. This parallel use of linguistic shibboleths in the European theater demonstrates that military forces across all armies recognized the value of this technique. It wasn't unique to the Pacific. It was a universal principle of warfare when languages collided. Other English phonetic features that Japanese speakers found difficult included the V sound, which doesn't exist in Japanese phonology. Typically gets pronounced as B. Very becomes berry. Victory becomes bictory. This sounds. Both voiced and voiceless. Think and this. Japanese doesn't have these. They typically become S or Z sounds, and the English vowel system, which contains many more distinct vowel sounds than the 5 vowels of Japanese. Security-conscious password selection could exploit any of these differences. Though the LR distinction appears to have been most commonly used, most reliable, most immediately obvious to the ear, the broader context of security measures in the Pacific theater provides crucial perspective. American forces throughout the Pacific faced persistent challenges with infiltration, deception, the difficulty of distinguishing friend from foe in conditions where visual identification was often impossible. The challenge and password system used by militaries worldwide became even more critical in the Pacific due to several factors unique to that theater. First, the jungle environment of most Pacific battlefields reduced visibility dramatically. Dense vegetation everywhere, heavy rainfall turning everything into a gray blur, frequent nighttime operations by Japanese forces who seemed to prefer darkness. Sentries often had to make identification decisions based purely on sound and verbal communication. Nothing else, just voices in the darkness. Second, Japanese tactical doctrine emphasized infiltration more than any other military in World War II. Night operations. Attacks designed to create maximum confusion and chaos. Psychological warfare through unpredictability. The challenge and password system itself has a long military history. Goes back centuries. In principle, it's simple. Basic, a sentry issues a challenge, typically a single word. The person being challenged must respond with the correct password. If the password is wrong or not given, the sentry takes appropriate action, usually means shooting first, asking questions later. The effectiveness of this system depends on several critical factors. The challenge and password must be changed regularly, daily ideally, to prevent compromise. To prevent the enemy from learning them and using them, they must be distributed to all friendly forces while being kept from the enemy, which is harder than it sounds. In combat, soldiers get separated. Communication breaks down. Passwords get captured with prisoners, and ideally, they should be chosen to make correct pronunciation by enemy forces difficult. This is where the linguistic element becomes crucial. The Military Intelligence Service Language School provides a fascinating counterpoint to the pronunciation testing story. Established November 1st, 1941, just over a month before Pearl Harbor, at the Presidio of San Francisco moved to Camp Savage, Minnesota in June 1942, following Executive Order 9066, which led to the internment of Japanese Americans from West Coast areas. Fear and racism wrapped in bureaucratic language. The school later relocated again to Fort Snelling, Minnesota in August 1944, operated continuously until June 1946. Missiles trained over 6,000 Japanese American soldiers during the war. Second-generation Japanese Americans, Nisei, born in America, raised in America. Speaking English as their first language, they became translators, interpreters, intelligence specialists. Some of the most valuable personnel in the Pacific Theater. They interrogated prisoners, translated captured documents, intercepted and translated radio communications, provided cultural insights that helped American commanders understand Japanese military thinking. Their contribution was essential, absolutely essential. Intelligence analysts estimated that Nisei linguists shortened the Pacific War by 2 years, saved countless thousands of lives, and their service was particularly notable, particularly poignant, because many of their families were confined in internment camps while they fought for the United States, their parents imprisoned behind barbed wire in the California desert, while they risked their lives for America. For pronunciation testing purposes, these Japanese American soldiers would have passed any L-based challenge automatically. Without thought, without effort, they spoke English with native pronunciation, having acquired the language during childhood in American communities. Their tongues had learned English sounds before learning Japanese sounds. Their brains had formed English phonetic categories first, so a Nisei soldier approaching a checkpoint in the darkness would say Lollapalooza perfectly. The L sounds rolling off his tongue as naturally as breathing, even though his face looked Japanese. Even though his name was Japanese, even though his parents spoke Japanese at home, his tongue spoke American. This meant that security forces needed to be aware, needed to be trained, that Japanese ethnicity did not automatically indicate enemy status, that the test measured linguistic background. Not race, not ethnicity. Not ancestry, language, nothing more. Nothing less. The absence of extensive discussion of pronunciation testing in most combat memoirs is itself revealing. Worth noting, if the practice was as systematic and elaborate as some popular accounts suggest, we'd expect more frequent mentions in the dozens of memoirs written by veterans. Eugene Sledge's With the Old Breed, Robert Leckey's Helmet for My Pillow, E.B. Sledge's diary entries. Dozens of other first-hand accounts, they talk about the horror of combat, the fear, the exhaustion, the friends lost, the things that haunt you forever. But they don't talk much about pronunciation testing. It's mentioned occasionally, in passing, but not dwelled upon. The relative silence suggests that while L-based passwords were used, the practice may have been more limited, more routine, less dramatic than later accounts implied. Security procedures that work effectively often become unremarkable to those using them daily. They fade into the background, become just part of the routine, like checking your rifle, or changing your socks, or taking your anti-malaria pills, just something you do. Every day, without thinking about it, without considering it worthy of mention. The eventual Allied victory at Guadalcanal came at staggering cost. Numbers that don't really convey the reality. But here they are anyway. American forces suffered approximately 7,100 killed, over 8,000 wounded. Disease casualties pushed the numbers even higher. Malaria, dysentery, tropical infections. Japanese casualties were much higher. Estimates of approximately 31,000 killed, though accurate counts are difficult because many died from disease and starvation rather than combat. American naval and air forces interdicted Japanese supply efforts, cutting off food, medical supplies, ammunition. The Japanese soldiers on Guadalcanal slowly starved, slowly weakened, slowly died. The successful Japanese evacuation in February 1943 saved approximately 10,000 Japanese troops. Evacuated under cover of darkness in a professionally executed withdrawal, those men were later deployed elsewhere, would fight again, but the strategic defeat was absolute and clear. Japan had lost the initiative in the Pacific theater, and would never regain it. From this point forward, America would be advancing. Japan would be retreating. The tide had turned. The limitations of pronunciation testing should be honestly acknowledged. No system is perfect. No security measure is foolproof. As Herbert noted in his interview, the test sometimes failed with English-educated Japanese. This wasn't theoretical. It actually happened. Any Japanese individual who'd spent childhood years in an English-speaking environment would have acquired native-like pronunciation. Their brains would have formed English phonetic categories during the critical period. They could pass L-based tests easily, perfectly. Japanese intelligence services were aware of this advantage, and occasionally employed individuals with English backgrounds for special operations, intelligence gathering, infiltration missions. Additionally, in the chaos of combat, subtle pronunciation differences might be difficult to detect reliably. Artillery fire, explosions, automatic weapons, shouting, screaming, dying. In that environment, could you really distinguish between a slightly mispronounced L and a correctly pronounced one? When your ears are ringing, when adrenaline is flooding your system, when everything sounds distorted? Maybe, maybe not. The test also carried risks of false positives. Friendly casualties from overly aggressive application. American forces in the Pacific included soldiers from diverse backgrounds. Filipino scouts and soldiers, Chinese Americans, Korean Americans, others whose English might carry non-standard pronunciations or accents. Security. Procedures needed to account for legitimate variation. In English pronunciation among Allied forces, the phonological differences between Filipino languages and Japanese meant that Filipino English speakers typically had no difficulty with L and R sounds. These phonemes exist in Tagalog and other Philippine languages, but their English might sound different from American pronunciation in other ways. Different rhythm, different intonation, different vowel qualities. A nervous sentry, exhausted, scared, might mistake that accent for something sinister, might shoot first, realize his mistake later. Despite these limitations, pronunciation testing represented an elegant solution to a genuine security problem. It exploited real phonological differences that were deeply rooted in brain structure, required no special equipment, no technology, no power source, could be administered quickly,
in seconds,
in complete darkness, in the worst conditions imaginable, and provided reasonable identification when other methods were unavailable or unreliable. The test worked because it accessed something fundamental about language acquisition, about being human. The fact that phonological patterns established during early childhood remain remarkably stable throughout life, more permanent than almost anything else about us. You can change your name, change your citizenship, change your beliefs, change your appearance, but you can't easily change your accent. Your native phonology, the way your tongue learned to move before you knew you had a tongue, that stays with you forever, a marker of where you came from, who you were before you knew who you were. The story of pronunciation testing at Guadalcanal serves multiple purposes today. For historians, it provides insight into practical details of security operations during the Pacific War, the daily realities of combat, the small innovations that saved lives. For linguists, it illustrates real-world applications of phonological knowledge, how abstract scientific principles manifest in concrete situations. For general audiences, it offers a fascinating example of how language itself can become a tool in warfare. How something as simple as pronunciation can mean the difference between life and death, but perhaps most importantly, it reminds us to be careful about historical claims. To distinguish between well-documented facts and later embellishments, to separate what we know from what we wish we knew. To be honest about evidence and its limitations, the verified core of the story is clear and compelling enough. Doesn't need embellishment. American forces at Guadalcanal used passwords containing L sounds to help identify Japanese infiltrators. Infiltrators who would struggle to pronounce those sounds correctly due to fundamental differences between Japanese and English phonology. This practice was documented by participants. Makes excellent sense given the linguistic realities. Represented practical innovation in the face of genuine security challenges. The specific word Lollapalooza appears in one contemporary source published during the war. Fits the pattern perfectly. Makes perfect tactical sense, though independent corroboration would strengthen the claim. We should be honest about that. Beyond this verified core, many popular accounts have added details that cannot be confirmed. Statistics that appear nowhere in historical records. Claims about systematic Pacific-wide programs for which no documentation exists. These embellishments make for dramatic storytelling, make for better movies, better documentaries, better bar stories, but they distort the historical record. Create false impressions about the nature and extent of pronunciation testing. The honest history is remarkable enough. Doesn't need the mythology. It shows American forces adapting to the challenges of jungle warfare, thinking creatively, exploiting linguistic differences to improve security, innovating at the tactical level to address immediate threats. It demonstrates the value of observation, practical intelligence, willingness to try new approaches, to experiment, to learn from the enemy, and it provides a window into the daily realities of combat operations in the Pacific theater, where security and identification weren't abstract concepts, they were life and death. Every single night, the constant threat of infiltration created persistent psychological pressure. Imagine living like that for 6 months, never fully sleeping, never fully relaxing, always listening for footsteps in the darkness, always wondering if that voice calling out is really your friend, or something pretending to be your friend. The Marines who developed and implemented pronunciation testing deserve recognition for their practical innovation. For their intelligence, for thinking beyond the obvious solutions. They didn't have linguists on staff, didn't have phoneticians, didn't have cognitive scientists explaining brain development and phonetic categorization. They just had observation, experience, and the willingness to try something new. The broader context of the campaign reminds us of the human cost of war, the complexity of military operations, the fact that victory requires thousands of small innovations alongside the big strategic decisions. The Japanese-American linguists who served in the Pacific deserve special recognition. Men who served their country while their country imprisoned their families, often while their families remained in internment camps, behind barbed wire, in the desert, treated as potential enemies, while they risked their lives translating intercepted messages, interrogating prisoners, sometimes going on combat patrols as interpreters. Their contribution to victory was essential, absolutely essential. And their story adds depth and nuance to our understanding of the Pacific War. The lessons learned at Guadalcanal informed American operations throughout the rest of the Pacific War. Every subsequent campaign benefited from the experience gained here. Each island assault saw improvements, better tactics, better logistics, better coordination between services, better understanding of Japanese tactics and capabilities, the amphibious assaults that followed. From Tarawa through the Marianas, the Philippines, Iwo Jima, Okinawa, all built on the foundation of experience gained at Guadalcanal. While we cannot document pronunciation testing at these later battles with the same certainty as Guadalcanal, the principle of exploiting language differences for security purposes remained sound and likely continued to be applied, in various forms, adapted to local conditions. The scientific understanding of phonology and language acquisition that explained why pronunciation testing worked came later, through research conducted during and after the war, but the Marines at Guadalcanal didn't need to understand the linguistic theory, didn't need to know about alveolar taps and lateral approximants, didn't need research papers about phonetic categorization in infant brain development. They just needed to recognize that Japanese speakers had difficulty with English L sounds, and that this difficulty could be used to identify infiltrators. This represents the best kind of practical knowledge. Observations derived from experience. Applied to solve immediate problems, no theory required, no academic credentials. Just eyes and ears and brains that could recognize patterns. The human dimension of the campaign extends beyond tactics and security measures. Beyond statistics and casualty figures, the men who fought there, both American and Japanese, displayed remarkable courage, determination, adaptability. In the face of conditions that tested human endurance to its limits, the Americans who developed and implemented pronunciation testing deserve recognition for innovation under pressure. The Japanese soldiers who faced these measures were themselves skilled and determined fighters, professional soldiers operating under extremely difficult conditions, fighting thousands of miles from home with increasingly tenuous supply lines, starving, sick with malaria and dysentery, cut off from reinforcement and resupply, but still fighting, still trying to retake that airfield. Night after night, there's courage on both sides of any war. We can acknowledge that without diminishing the justness of one cause or the other. The post-war research into the phonetic phenomena that made pronunciation testing effective enriched our understanding of how humans acquire and process language. Linguists and cognitive scientists, many of whom had served in military intelligence during the war, conducted extensive studies of second language pronunciation acquisition. Research by Patricia, Kuhl and others demonstrated that infants are born with the ability to distinguish phonetic contrasts from any human language. Universal phonetic discrimination, a Japanese baby can distinguish English R from English L perfectly, just as well as an American baby. But this universal ability narrows during the first year of life, as the brain specializes for the phonetic categories of the native language, as neural pathways strengthen for some distinctions and weaken for others. By 12 months of age, babies have become specialized for their native language. They've lost the ability to distinguish contrasts that don't matter in that language. This neural commitment to native phonetic categories is essential for efficient language processing. Makes you better at your native language, but creates exactly the kind of limitations that made pronunciation testing effective. During the war, adult Japanese speakers trying to master English L and R sounds weren't simply learning new articulations, weren't just learning new mouth movements, they were attempting to rewire neural perceptual categories that had been established decades earlier, during that critical period in infancy, a task that cognitive science has since shown to be extremely difficult. Often impossible to complete fully. You can improve with years of training, with focused practice, but you'll almost certainly retain some trace of your native phonology, some accent, some marker of where you came from. The pronunciation testing used during World War II influenced linguistic research into the concept of foreign accent more broadly. Before the war, accented speech was often viewed simply as incorrect pronunciation, mistakes that could be fixed through practice and instruction, errors that reflected poor learning or lack of effort. Post-war research revealed that foreign accent reflects deep structural differences in phonetic processing. Not simple errors, not laziness, not lack of intelligence, but fundamental differences in how the brain has organized sound categories. This understanding led to more sophisticated approaches to language teaching, and recognition that adult language learners will almost always retain some accent features from their native language, no matter how hard they try, no matter how many years they practice. For military security, this meant that pronunciation testing would remain a viable identification method in future conflicts. Where language differences between forces could be exploited, the principle has been applied in various forms in subsequent conflicts, Vietnam, Iraq, Afghanistan, though modern technology has added tools like voice stress, analysis and linguistic profiling, but the basic principle remains. Your native phonology reveals who you are, where you came from, what language shaped your brain during those critical early years. The thousands of Japanese Americans who served in the Pacific illustrate the complex dynamics beautifully. These Nisei soldiers who'd grown up speaking English demonstrated, through their native pronunciation, that linguistic identity could cross ethnic lines. Their faces said Japanese. Their names said Japanese. Their parents said Japanese, but their tongues said American, because that's where they'd grown up. That's the language that shaped their brains during infancy. Conversely, Japanese soldiers who attempted infiltration revealed through their non-native pronunciation that linguistic identity was not determined by ethnicity, not by blood, not by race, not by ancestry, but by developmental language exposure, by which sounds shaped your brain before you knew you had a brain. This distinction had important implications, though perhaps not fully articulated during the war. The test measured language background, not ethnicity, not race. It was the correlation between Japanese citizenship and Japanese language background that made the testing effective, not ethnicity itself. The story reminds us that military success depends on countless small innovations, developed by those facing immediate problems. Finding practical solutions with whatever resources they have available, the recognition that language differences could be exploited for identification purposes demonstrated practical intelligence. Tactical flexibility, creative thinking under pressure. The systematic use of L-based passwords at Guadalcanal represented genuine innovation, addressed a real security challenge, saved lives. Today, the story stands as a small but significant chapter in the larger history of the Pacific War. It illustrates how language itself can become a factor in warfare, how that most human of characteristics can be weaponized, how sounds learned in childhood can determine survival in combat. It shows how understanding differences between languages can provide tactical advantages, how knowledge becomes power, how information becomes security, and it demonstrates that success in warfare often comes from combining large strategic decisions with countless small tactical improvements. That big victories are built on thousands of small innovations. The historical record reveals both achievements and limitations when examined carefully, and, honestly, pronunciation testing worked at Guadalcanal, provided sentries with a quick and reliable method for identifying potential infiltrators, made security more effective, reduced casualties on both sides of the perimeter. It made perfect sense given linguistic realities. Given the fundamental differences between Japanese and English phonological systems, but it was not a perfect system. Not foolproof, not without limitations and risks, not a comprehensive Pacific-wide program, not the elaborate operation that some popular accounts have suggested, by understanding what the evidence actually shows, and being clear about the limits of that evidence. We honor the memory of those who fought in the Pacific, while maintaining the intellectual honesty that proper history requires. That truth demands. The Marines at Guadalcanal faced extraordinary challenges in one of the first major American offensive operations of the Pacific War. First time on the attack, first time going ashore against fortified positions, first time fighting in jungle terrain, first time facing Japanese infantry in sustained combat, learning everything the hard way, through blood and experience. Their innovation in developing practical security measures like pronunciation testing, alongside their courage in combat, their determination in holding Henderson Field against repeated Japanese attacks, their endurance through 6 months of hell contributed to a strategic victory that changed the course of the Pacific War. That proved America could take ground from Japan, could hold it, could win. The verified core of the story remains powerful. Doesn't need embellishment, doesn't need mythology. American forces exploited fundamental differences in how Japanese and English speakers produce and perceive liquid consonant sounds to create a security measure that was simple, effective, difficult to counterfeit. This application of linguistic knowledge represented exactly the kind of tactical innovation that contributed to Allied victory in the Pacific, whether derived from conscious understanding of phonology or simply from practical observation and experience. The result was the same. Lives saved, security improved, infiltrators identified. One word in the darkness, that's all it took. One word. And the way you pronounced it revealed everything. Your childhood, your native language, your identity, the shape of sounds formed before memory, before thought, before consciousness itself. Your tongue moved the way it learned to move before you knew you had a tongue. And that movement told the truth. Even when you desperately wanted to lie, the jungle still stands on Guadalcanal today, thick and green and suffocating as ever. Reclaimed most of what was there, nature healing the scars of battle. Henderson Field still exists, now called Honiara International Airport. Commercial jets land where Wildcats and dauntless dive bombers once took off. Tourists arrive where Marines once stormed ashore, but on quiet nights. If you listen carefully, if you let yourself imagine, you can almost hear the echoes across 7 decades of silence. A sentry's voice cutting through the darkness. Tense, alert, afraid, halt. Who goes there? A challenge hanging in the humid Pacific air. A password required? A test waiting to be passed or failed? and in the fraction of a second it takes to pronounce a single letter, in the tiny movements of tongue against teeth, the sound of survival, or the silence that follows a fatal mistake. One word, one letter, one sound, that's all it took to separate friend from enemy, us from them, life from death in the darkness, in the jungle, in the war, where language itself became a weapon and the human tongue became the most reliable detector ever invented, more accurate than any machine, more sensitive than any instrument because it measured something that couldn't be faked, couldn't be trained, couldn't be overcome. It measured childhood, memory, identity, itself, the shape of sounds learned before you knew. You were learning anything. That's what saved lives on Guadalcanal. That's what killed infiltrators in the darkness. Not bullets alone, not training alone, not courage alone, but language. Pure language. The architecture of human speech, the letter L, and the inability of the human brain to fully unlearn what it learned. First, that's the weapon that won those dark Pacific nights. That's the detector that never failed when everything else did. One word. That's all it took. One word spoken in the darkness. And you lived, or you died. No second chances. No explanations. Just the sound of a single syllable hanging in the humid Pacific air. And a sentry's finger on a trigger. This is the story of how a letter became a weapon. How the human tongue became a lie detector. And how something as simple as pronunciation determined who saw the sunrise. And who didn't. August 7th, 1942. Dawn breaks over the Solomon Islands like a blade cutting through silk. The horizon bleeds red and gold. The ocean looks almost peaceful. Beautiful even. Then the warships open fire. 11,000 United States Marines hit the beaches of Guadalcanal. Boats grinding against coral. Men stumbling through surf. The first major American offensive against the Empire of Japan. They called it Operation Watchtower. The Navy brass called it something else. Operation Shoestring, because everyone knew the truth. They were going in with too little of everything. Too few ships, too few supplies, too few men, too little ammunition, too little time to prepare. But they went anyway, because someone had to, because the Japanese were building an airfield. And if that airfield became operational, Allied supply lines to Australia would be cut like a throat. The Marines stormed ashore expecting hell. What they found was something worse. An empty beach. No resistance. The Japanese construction crews had fled into the jungle, which meant they were out there, somewhere, watching, waiting, and what those Marines would discover in the coming weeks, in that suffocating green hell, wasn't just an enemy armed with steel and fire, it was an enemy who could whisper in your own language, who could call out for help in perfect English, who could approach your checkpoint, in the darkness and sound, just like the buddy you'd been, sharing cigarettes with an hour ago, until he put a bayonet in your back. The problem revealed itself within the first 48 hours. The jungle of Guadalcanal is nothing like the training films prepared them for. Nothing like the California hills where they'd practiced amphibious landings. This is a different world entirely. Visibility drops to arm's length in the dense tropical vegetation. Trees choke out the sunlight. Vines hang like tripwires. The canopy overhead blocks out the sky, turning midday into perpetual twilight. And at night the darkness becomes absolute. A physical thing, pressing against your eyeballs. You can hear everything. Every sound amplified. The rustle of leaves that might be wind, or might be movement. The snap of a twig that could be nothing, or could be everything. Footsteps approaching your position. But from which direction? And belonging to whom? The jungle plays tricks on your ears. Sounds bounce off trees. Echo strangely. Come from everywhere and nowhere at once, and the Japanese know this terrain. They've been here for months. They move through it like ghosts. Like they were born in this green maze. Some of them speak English. Perfect English. They learned it in universities. In trade schools. In California, ironically enough, before the war, some had been students at UCLA, Berkeley, Stanford. Now they're out there. Using that education to kill. Some wear captured American uniforms. Stripped from dead Marines, dog tags still attached. Blood still on the fabric, so when you're manning a checkpoint, when darkness has swallowed everything, when you hear boots crunching through the undergrowth, when a voice calls out in English, how do you know? How do you possibly know if it's Private Johnson coming back from patrol? Or if it's someone pretending to be Private Johnson, using Johnson's voice, wearing Johnson's uniform, carrying Johnson's rifle, because Johnson might be lying dead 50 yards away. Throat cut, identity stolen. The traditional security measures collapse in this environment. Password systems work in theory, but what happens when the enemy captures your passwords? Takes them off a dead officer's body, memorizes them, documents can be forged, or stolen, uniforms can be taken. Dog tags can be looted, physical appearance means nothing when you can't see faces. Can't see anything except shapes moving in darkness. Even voices can deceive. When stress and fear have your heart hammering, when every shadow looks like death, how can you trust your ears? Marines started dying at checkpoints, shot by their own side, because they approached wrong, or didn't respond fast enough, or said the wrong thing. But Japanese infiltrators were getting through too, slipping past sentries, sabotaging equipment, cutting communication lines, killing men in their sleep. The casualties mounted, and the brass knew they needed a solution. Fast. The answer came from an unexpected place, from a simple observation, made by someone who'd been paying attention to the enemy's voice, not what they were saying, but how they were saying it. Master Technical Sergeant James W. Herbert landed with the assault forces that first morning. Combat correspondent, United States Marine Corps Reserve. His job was to document, to watch, to listen, to record history as it happened, and Herbert noticed something in the interrogations of captured Japanese soldiers, in the conversations overheard when enemy troops were calling out to each other in the jungle. When they spoke English, something sounded off. Not wrong exactly, but different, distinctly different, especially when they pronounced certain sounds, certain letters, particularly the letter L. It came out wrong. Every time, not in an obvious way, but in a way that, once you heard it, you couldn't unhear it. Herbert wasn't a linguist, didn't know the technical reasons, didn't need to. He just knew that Japanese soldiers couldn't pronounce L the way Americans did, and he knew that this difference could save lives. In March of 1943, months after the battle had ended, Herbert sat down for an official interview. Naval records preserved his testimony. Every word matters because this is direct evidence, firsthand, unfiltered by decades of storytelling and mythology. We always had passwords including the letter L, Herbert explained. His voice matter-of-fact, clinical, the voice of someone reporting simple truth. Because L was thought to be hard for the Japanese to pronounce since there is no L in the Japanese vocabulary. Read that sentence again. Slowly. Always. Not sometimes. Not when we remembered. Not as an occasional measure, always every password. Every challenge. Every single night on that island. The letter L was there. Waiting, testing, revealing truth. The letter L became more than a letter. It became a weapon. Invisible. Unbreakable. More reliable than steel. More accurate than a rifle sight, built into the very fabric of human speech. By 1600 hours on August 8th, 4 p.m. for those keeping civilian time, the Marines had pushed inland and captured the prize, the nearly completed Japanese airfield. This was why they were here, why they'd crossed thousands of miles of ocean, why they were dying in this jungle. The Japanese had called it Lunga Airfield. The Americans renamed it immediately, Henderson Field, after Major Lofton R. Henderson, Marine aviator. Shot down leading dive bombers at the Battle of Midway 2 months earlier. The first aircraft landed on August 12th, a PBY Catalina flying boat, lumbering in like a pregnant goose, touching down on the rough coral runway, proof that the field was operational. By the 20th, 31 aircraft had arrived. Grumman F-4F Wildcats, Douglas SBD Dauntless dive bombers, the permanent air contingent, the Cactus Air Force they'd call themselves. Control of this airfield became everything, the reason for existence. The focal point of a 6-month campaign that would determine whether America could go on the offensive, or whether the Japanese would push them back into the sea, and the Japanese wanted it back, desperately. They threw everything at it. Naval bombardments, air raids, ground assaults, again and again and again. But most dangerous were the infiltrators, the ghosts in the jungle. Coming at night, always at night. They came in small groups, sometimes alone, moving through the jungle with inhuman patience, wearing excellent camouflage. Jungle vegetation attached to their uniforms until they looked like walking bushes, moving with remarkable stealth, silent, disciplined, professional. Their missions varied: gather intelligence, sabotage aircraft, cut communication lines, misdirect American forces, kill sentries, sow chaos and confusion, and some spoke English. Really good English, well enough to fool you. If you weren't paying attention, if you weren't listening for that one sound, that one letter. The perimeter around Henderson Field became a nightly battleground of nerves and shadows. A psychological war zone where trust itself became a casualty. Sentries posted at checkpoints faced an impossible task. Make split-second decisions in absolute darkness. Life or death. Friend or enemy. Shoot or don't shoot. Get it wrong and you murder one of your own. Get it wrong the other way and a Japanese soldier slits your throat. The pressure was immense, crushing. Men stood guard with their fingers trembling on triggers. Hearts pounding. Sweat running despite the night chill. Every approaching footstep could be death. Every voice calling out could be deception. Traditional identification methods crumbled like wet paper. Documents could be captured. Perfectly authentic papers taken from dead officers. Forged with remarkable skill. Uniforms could be stripped from corpses. complete with unit patches, rank insignia, even personal effects. Physical appearance meant absolutely nothing when you couldn't see faces, when darkness reduced everything to shapes and sound. Even voices could deceive. Japanese intelligence had learned to recruit soldiers with language skills. Men who'd lived in America, who'd studied English for years, who could mimic American accents with disturbing accuracy. The Marines needed something that couldn't be faked, something that revealed identity through characteristics the infiltrator couldn't consciously control, couldn't prepare for, couldn't overcome through training or determination. They found it in the architecture of the human brain, in patterns formed in childhood, in sounds learned before conscious memory, in the way the tongue learns to move before you even know you have a tongue. They found it in phonology, though they didn't call it that. They just called it the L test, and it worked. To understand why this was so effective, you need to understand something fundamental about how humans learn language. How the brain processes speech sounds. Japanese possesses one liquid phoneme. Linguists represent it in writing as R, but it's pronounced nothing like an English R, and nothing like an English L. It's something else entirely. Something in between. A quick tap of the tongue against the alveolar ridge. That's the bumpy area just behind your upper front teeth. Try it. Touch your tongue to that spot and pull it away quickly. That's closer to the Japanese liquid sound. English has two distinct liquid sounds, two separate phonemes, the L and the R, and they're produced in completely different ways. The L tongue tip pressed firmly against that alveolar ridge, while air flows around the sides of your tongue. The R, tongue pulled back, curled, not touching anything. The sound resonating in the back of your mouth. For native English speakers, these two sounds are as different as night and day, as different as hot and cold. You learn to distinguish them before you could walk, before you can remember learning anything. Your brain has separate categories for them, separate neural pathways. When you hear an L, your brain registers it as fundamentally different from an R. But for Japanese speakers, these two sounds occupy one perceptual category, one mental box. Both the English L and the English R get processed through that single Japanese liquid phoneme. This isn't about intelligence. It's not about physical ability. It's not a hearing problem. Japanese speakers can physically make both sounds with proper training. Their tongues and mouths work the same way as everyone else's. They can hear the acoustic differences between the sounds when isolated in a laboratory setting, but in actual speech, in real conversation, under pressure, their brains automatically process both English sounds as instances of that single Japanese sound. It's hardwired. Established in childhood, before conscious thought, before memory. Research conducted during and after the war confirmed this phenomenon scientifically. Study after study. Goto in 1971. Miyawaki and colleagues in 1975. Takagi and Man in 1995. All documented that Japanese speakers struggle to perceive the English R and L distinction, even after extended exposure to English. Even after years of practice, Takagi and Man found something particularly striking. Japanese speakers who'd lived in the United States for over 12 years, who'd been immersed in English-speaking environments for more than a decade, still had significantly more difficulty identifying R and L sounds than native English speakers, more than 12 years. And the difficulty persisted. The 1975 Miyawaki study revealed something even more relevant to the wartime application. When researchers manipulated recordings of R and L sounds, stripped away certain acoustic information to make them sound less speech-like, Japanese speakers could distinguish them as well as native English speakers, proving conclusively that the difficulty wasn't in hearing, wasn't in the ears. It was in how the brain processed those differences as linguistic sounds, as language. For military security purposes, this linguistic reality was pure gold, a gift from the structure of human cognition itself. Japanese soldiers attempting infiltration faced an obstacle they literally could not overcome. Not through practice, not through determination, not through any amount of preparation. Even soldiers who'd studied English extensively, who knew thousands of words of vocabulary, who understood grammar perfectly, who could maintain complex conversations in English, would betray themselves through pronunciation. Through that single letter, it wasn't under conscious control. That's the crucial point. You can't fake your native phonology under stress. You can't override patterns formed in infancy under stress, under fatigue, under time pressure, under the adrenaline rush of approaching an enemy checkpoint. Automatic native language patterns would emerge, like breathing, like your heartbeat, automatic regardless of intentions, regardless of preparation, regardless of how desperately the infiltrator wanted to pronounce it correctly. The brain would betray him. The Marines weaponized this knowledge with devastating efficiency. Challenge words containing multiple L sounds became standard procedure. Every night, every checkpoint, every patrol. When a sentry challenged an approaching figure with an L-based password, everything depended on what came back. A native English speaker would pronounce it automatically, correctly, without thinking. The tongue would move the right way because it had moved that way since childhood. Since before memory, a Japanese speaker would substitute sounds closer to their native liquid, not deliberately, not consciously, but automatically, producing something that sounded wrong to a trained ear, distinctly wrong, unmistakably wrong, fatally wrong. One specific word entered the historical record. Though we need to be careful about the evidence, it comes from a single source, but it's a contemporary source, published during the war itself. Oliver Gramling, journalist with the Associated Press, a serious correspondent with access to military sources, published a book in 1942 called Free Men Are Fighting: The Story of World War II, page 315. Gramling wrote that Japanese soldiers would sometimes approach checkpoints posing as American or Filipino military personnel. He stated that sentries would use a shibboleth such as Lollapalooza. Let that word roll around in your mouth for a moment. Say it out loud. Lollapalooza, an American slang term, meaning something outstanding, extraordinary, remarkable, perfect Americana. The kind of word that couldn't possibly exist in any other language. But more importantly, listen to its structure. Its phonetic architecture. It contains 4 L sounds, in rapid succession. At the beginning of syllables, lu, pu, lu, zu. For a native English speaker, it rolls off the tongue. Natural, easy, automatic. For a Japanese speaker, each L presents a distinct obstacle. 4 separate chances to fail, making it virtually impossible to pronounce correctly without years of specialized training. And who has years? When you have seconds, Gramling noted that sentries were instructed to listen specifically to the first 2 syllables. If those syllables came back sounding like roar roar instead of lolla, the sentry would open fire, without waiting to hear the remainder, without hesitation, without second guessing, because that pronunciation meant only one thing. The person approaching was not who they claimed to be. The instruction makes perfect tactical sense. You wouldn't need to wait for the complete password. The first 2 syllables told you everything. Reducing exposure time during the challenge. Reducing the window of vulnerability. Get the answer. Process it. Act on it. All in under 2 seconds, but we need to be precise about the evidence here. This is important. Gramling's book is the only known source for Lollapalooza specifically. No other contemporary account mentions it. No official Marine Corps after-action reports. No operational histories. No other memoirs from participants. Richard Tregaskis wrote Guadalcanal Diary in 1943, based on his time as a war correspondent on the island, living with the Marines, watching the battle unfold. He doesn't mention Lollapalooza, Robert Leckey's memoir, Helmet for My Pillow, Eugene Sledge's With the Old Breed, other first-hand accounts from men who were there, similarly silent on that specific word. So what do we know for certain? We know that L-based passwords were systematically used. Herbert's direct testimony confirms it. Multiple sources confirm the practice existed. Whether Lollapalooza was one of those specific passwords remains plausible. It fits all the tactical requirements. It appears in a contemporary source published during the war. It aligns perfectly with the documented practice. But additional corroboration would make the case stronger. We need to be honest about what we can prove versus what makes a good story. The campaign lasted 6 brutal months, August 7th, 1942 to February 9th, 1943, when Japanese forces successfully evacuated their remaining troops under cover of darkness. During those 6 months, hell came to earth on a small island in the Pacific. Marines and later Army reinforcements faced constant pressure. The Japanese threw everything at Henderson Field. Naval bombardments that turned night into day. Air raids that came daily. Ground assaults that tested the perimeter again and again. Major battles erupted with terrifying regularity. The Battle of the Tenaru on August 21st, where Japanese forces launched a night assault across the Tenaru River and were slaughtered in the crossing, the Battle of Edson's Ridge, September 12th through 14th.